Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Brown, and today I will be telling you why Pluto should be considered a planet and the classifications of a planet. Ever since we could remember, Pluto has been regarded as a planet. All throughout grade school, we were taught in science class that Pluto was the last planet in our nine-planet solar system. That all changed in the year 2006. According to National Geographic, 2006 was the year Pluto was reclassified as a dwarf planet. There are many supporters of the planet Pluto theory, and currently reveal Pluto as a planet today. However, to fully grasp the concept of Pluto reclassification is to understand the story of Ceres. Ceres is unfamiliar to many people today, and for good reason. Ceres is a former planet discovered on January 1st, 1801 by an Italian astronomer, Giuseppe Piazzi. Once Ceres was discovered, 4 more planets that were very similar to Ceres were discovered. Those 4 quickly turned into thousands, as these planets have now been categorized into what we know today as the asteroid belt. Ceres, being the largest object in the asteroid belt, was reclassified as a dwarf planet in the 1850s. This brings up the question, what classifies a planet? And how does Ceres relate to Pluto? What is a planet? According to NASA, the most recent definition of a planet was adopted by the International Astronomical Union, or the IAU, in 2006. It says planets must do these 3 things to be classified as a planet. It must, 1, orbit a star, and in our case, the sun. 2, it must be big enough to have enough gravity to force it into a spherical shape. And finally, it must be big enough that its gravity clears away any objects of similar size near its orbit around the sun. Pluto's complications comes with the 3rd qualification of a planet. The IAU downgraded the status of Pluto to that of a dwarf planet because it did not meet the 3 criteria the IAU uses to define a full-size planet. Essentially, Pluto meets all of the criteria except 1. It has not cleared its neighboring region of other objects. CNET.com argues that Pluto is a planet, regardless of scientists' emotions. Due to its distance from the sun and size, people have deemed the treatment of Pluto to be unfair. Pluto is geologically active, filled with the same essential things Earth is filled with, such as rocks and ice. It is also believed that the 10,000 members of the IAU, only 2% voted to reclassify the planet, leaving roughly 9,500 plus members void of votes. Pluto's reclassification came in 2006 with a familiar, unfortunate story. Scientists began discovering objects composed of mostly rock and ice, very similar to the build of Pluto, in the same region as Pluto. But as long as Pluto was the largest among these objects, scientists considered it a planet. It wasn't until the discovery of Eris, a rocky, ice-ridden spherical object appearing larger than the scale of Pluto, that Pluto was no longer indeed a planet. Pluto was reclassified and recategorized into what we know now as the distant Kuiper belt. In conclusion, Pluto shouldn't be considered a planet because it doesn't meet all of the qualifications of being deemed one. Planets should orbit a star, in our case, the sun, be big enough to have its own gravitational pull to form it into a spherical shape, and be big enough to clear the way of any objects that may disturb its orbit around the sun. With Pluto's lack of gravity and the similarity of the objects in the distant Kuiper belt, Pluto has finally been returned to its rightful classification and rightful home. I have a quick video to share and to further dive into the topic of Pluto's reclassification and why it was reclassified.
9 planets orbiting 1 star. Looking at this model makes people wonder, why do astronomers want to ditch Pluto? The problem is pictures like this in textbooks are lies. Well, not lies exactly, but unhelpful. They give the impression that the planets are similar-ish in size and evenly-ish spaced, but the reality couldn't be more different. Here, dear Terrans, is our home planet Earth, and this is Jupiter next to it at the correct scale. Rather bigger than you probably thought. If we take this diagram and adjust for the correct sizes of the planets, it looks like this. Unless you're watching the video in full-screen HD mode, you might not be even able to see Pluto. So, size differences are vast, and Pluto is the smallest by far, but it's not just small for a planet, it's also smaller than 9 moons. Triton, Europa, our own moon, Io, Callisto, Titan, and Ganymede. Even if you show the correct relative sizes, the distances are still a problem. Think about it, if Jupiter was this close to Earth, it wouldn't look like a dot in the night sky, but would be rather overwhelming. So it must be really far away, which makes drawing it to scale rather a challenge. If you want the length of a piece of paper to represent the distance from Mercury to Pluto, then giant Jupiter would be the size of a dust mite on that page, and Pluto a bacterium. But excluding Pluto from the Planet Club just for being tiny and small isn't reason enough, and quickly brings out the Pluto defenders. In order to understand what Pluto really is, we need to first discuss a planet you've never heard of, Ceres. Back in 1801, astronomers found a new planet in the huge gap between Mars and Jupiter. It was a small planet, but they loved it anyway and named it Ceres. The next year, astronomers found another small planet in the same area and named it Pallas. A few years later, they found a third one, Juno, and then, funnily enough, a fourth one, Vesta. And for several decades, children learned the 11 planets of the solar system. But astronomers kept finding more and more of these objects and became increasingly uncomfortable calling them planets because they were much more like each other than the planets on either side. So a new category was born. Asteroids in the asteroid belt, and the tiny planets were relabeled, which is why you've never heard of them. And it was a good decision too, as astronomers have now found hundreds of thousands of asteroids, which would be a lot for a kid to memorize if they were all still planets. Back to Pluto. It was discovered in 1930, making it the then 9th planet. First estimates put Pluto about the size of Neptune, but with more observations that was revised down, and down, and down. While Pluto shrank, astronomers started to find other similar objects orbiting in the same zone. Sound familiar? While school kids kept memorizing the 9 planets, some astronomers grew uneasy about including Pluto because the size estimates continued to shrink. They learned that Pluto is made mostly of ice, and they continue to find lots and lots of icy objects at the edge of the solar system just like Pluto. This problem could be ignored as long as no one found an ice ball bigger than Pluto, which is exactly what happened in 2006 with the discovery of Eris. Once again, astronomers recategorized the solar system and grouped these distant objects, including Pluto, into a new area called the Kuiper Belt. And that's the story of Pluto, a miscategorized planet that finally found its home, just like Ceres.
Thank you. I hope to have given you insight on our solar system and hope for future exciting discoveries in our galaxy.